2, 1.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to creating and refining the product backlog. If you've worked in Scrum or Kanban or maybe another framework, you've heard the term backlog or product backlog, and it's kind of a mystery. I'm going to make the assumption you're coming in here already knowing the framework. We're going to focus on those specific areas of the framework. If you don't know Scrum or Kanban, I think you'll still find this useful, and you can apply it once you fill in the blanks on understanding the framework. So again, my name's Ken. I'm with Improving. If you are not familiar with Improving, we have 14 offices across North America. We specialize in custom software development and training services, application development, consulting services, as well as recruiting services. I've been with Improving for about 13, 14 years. I lost track of time. I was one of the original crew here, and I also teach computer science part-time and have a few books behind me as well. So I do have a software development bent, which I'll bring into this, but I also want you to understand I've been working for the last 2.5 years on a business transformation on a Fortune 10 sized company on applying these practices in a non-technology space. So you can extend a lot of these things we're talking about beyond the realm of building software. The objectives, and I should also say as a preamble here, I am on a 20-second delay. They tell me it's so they can do closed captioning. I think the truth is so they can bleep me out if I say naughty words, but I promise not to say any naughty words. So hopefully the closed captioning is working if that's helpful for you. If you do have questions in this live event, you can add them to the chat window, and Justin, who's our moderator and producer for this event, he'll keep up with them and he'll let me know about the questions so that I can interject, but recognize that they won't be responded to directly in real time. The objectives I put together for you today: describing and defining a product, what a product versus project is, a little vocabulary lesson, where nouns are helpful, where verbs are helpful, understanding the difference between a product backlog and a sprint backlog, an approach to taking a top-down stakeholder-driven approach to building backlogs. I'll talk a bit about backlog sizing, where it's useful, what you can use it for, and how to do it a bit. How to create quality product backlog items, which we abbreviate as PBIs. You may have heard the term user story. What's a user story? Where does that fit in? Where does user story not fit in? I'll kind of bust through some of that vocabulary as well. And we'll go through a timeline from start to finish on a typical project. Where does a product backlog get built? Where do you refine it? And where do you finish using it? Let's start by talking about the term project. And the PMI, Project Management Institute, was formed in 1969 as the standard setting body, the official body of expertise of project management. And they define a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create something of value. It could be a product, could be a service, or any other type of result, but constrained by budget, by schedule, and by your budget, schedule, and the scope of the product that you're actually building. We call that the iron triangle. And many of you probably heard that before. I want to delineate that from what is a product, because we want to drive an agility into taking a more of a product-centric versus a task-centric or project-centric approach. So when it comes to building a product, it could really be anything. It could be building a new website, building a new software application, a mobile application, it could be building a video game, or some type of electronic device, even building a PowerPoint presentation or a book or some type of a procedure manual. I've been working in energy for the last 2.5 years, building a plan for exploration and mining of oil, or building wind farms, or building robots is another fun, cool example as well. Think of the thing that you're building as your product. So knowing what our product is job one. And then the next step is, how do we establish our product backlog? So you want to start with some type of a rough sketch of vision of what your product is. And then once you have that vision, you have a bunch of work to do that's involved in building this product. And then at some point in time, all that work gets done. And then we have a completed product. So that's as simple as it gets. Now, the complexity has to do with the component parts of this thing we're building, and timeframes and budgets and schedules, and collaboration and indecisiveness, and all these things come into play, and that's where the frameworks, Scrum and Kanban, help us. So I want you to understand that when we use the term backlog, it's completely applicable in the Scrum world, but if you're in the Kanban world, it's completely applicable there as well. It's the stack of work that needs to be accomplished, the stuff we need to do. So on the Scrum framework, which is depicted on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the product owner establishes the vision, manages the product backlog. This is our stack of stuff. What's interesting about Scrum, and in the Scrum guide, the backlog is a prerequisite starting point to be able to begin your first sprint or your first time box, but it actually says very little about how to build that. In Kanban, we need a stack of work as well, and we call that our backlog as well. So whether you if you're using one of the Kanban frameworks or you're using the Scrum framework, again, you're going to find very little about how to build backlogs well. You may find books or resources on how to write a good user story or acceptance criteria, but that's at the granular level. I'm talking about how do you get started and how do you build a backlog that's going to be useful and make sure that you build the right thing, because that's really at the center point of what the backlog is for, is to make sure that you build the right thing. So one useful technique I found in delineating what goes in a backlog from what goes in our task plan is delineating nouns versus verbs. So for example, if this house were a project, maybe the cleaning of this house or the renovation of this house or decoration of this house, one way of chunking the work up into smaller pieces is describe each of the component parts of this house. And by breaking them up, then I can make them smaller things. For example, if I find that the living room is kind of a big project, maybe I break it into the sitting area and the entertainment area. Or the kitchen is a good example of a complex component that can be broken up into smaller things. But again, the key lesson here is think of the backlog as containing nouns. Now contrast that with verbs. You typically think of verbs on a to-do list, a task list, or I need to clean the house, I need to dust, wipe, make the bed, clean, vacuum. See the verbs in here? These are specific tasks, and these verbs, these tasks tend to have only a high degree of reliability within a short time frame. So our plans that are specifically task-driven, like a traditional project plan, introduces a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty into our plan because the task may need to change down the road, while the actual outcome or the product we're building, represented by the noun, that has a longer life expectancy and value proposition in the timing of the framework. Now in Scrum, tasks are optional and can be included in the sprint backlog, and I'll show you where and when that falls in as we go through the presentation today. So in a nutshell, if we build our product backlog, we depict those things over on the left-hand side here as these chunks. Think of them as nouns. The sprint backlog has a time frame of some time period less than a month. Most teams that I work with do 1 week or 2 week sprints. So the exercise is pulling items off the top of the product backlog into your sprint backlog, nouns once again, and those go into the front part of my sprint backlog. These are the things that I can build within that time frame. So tying in the vocabulary here, then I pull items from the product backlog into my 2 week sprint backlog. These are the nouns, and then I have my to-do column. These are the tasks. This is where the verbs go. So yes, we still have tasks in Scrum, but they're at the granular level within a 1 to 4 week time frame within the period of a sprint, not over the extensive period of a multiple month project, right? We don't define tasks until we initiate planning on the next sprint or the next 2 week time frame. And by the way, you'll see the first header here is PBI. That's abbreviation for product backlog item, which is what these backlog things are described in the Scrum framework.
Got a question for you, Ken.
Sure. Question.
Says, does a product need a complete backlog before you start this process?
That's a good question. Does a product need a complete backlog before you start? It's almost impossible to have a complete product backlog before you start. And that's where empiricism comes in. And that's why we time box the development of the backlog as well. As we want to get away from the old school, let's spend weeks or months building the perfect backlog before we actually start doing the work. Well, that's wasteful and it delays value. So you build as much as you can within a time box. And when I talk about a time box, I'm talking about less than a day. If you get all the right stakeholders in the room and they can represent the external stakeholders' needs effectively, you ought to be able to build a pretty robust product backlog in less than a day. Most of the teams I've coached on pretty large projects over the last couple of years, backlogs are developed in less than half a day, but then we continue to refine it. And I'll show that on the timeline when we go along. Justin, were there any other questions before I move on?
That's all we've got right now.
All right. So here's our old friend, the Gantt chart, developed over 100 years ago by a guy named Henry Gantt. You've probably seen it, you've probably used it. These are those task plans. And you'll see there, the first column there after the ID is the task name. And the challenge with one of these things is that the uncertainty increases the further to the right that you get in the plan. So let's say I built a Gantt chart to build a bridge, as is depicted up above here. All right, what does a bridge look like at the 50% mark? I finished 50% of the effort on my schedule. I ought to have half of a bridge, right? But the reality is I have no bridge at the 50% mark. Now, that doesn't make those initial tasks unnecessary. They're all predecessors to leading up to doing the surveying and the vendor selection and the grading of the earth and all the other things that has to happen before we can start building the bridge. So for civil engineering projects, the task-centric approach can be fairly reliable because we have a long history of previous projects that are similar in nature. So instead of drawing on our own experience on this project, we're drawing upon the experience of the numerous other similar projects we've done in the past, and that informs our plan here. Okay, that's the task-centric or project-centric approach. But there's a little bit of a misleading metric here because 50% complete doesn't mean that we have half of a bridge. And again, there's risk in making sure during the second half that I actually get that bridge built because of the decreasing fidelity of the tasks the further I get out to the right. So let's contrast that with product-centric project management, where when I finish half of the product backlog, I have actually created 50% of the product itself. So for this reason, ordering the product backlog is essential because I need to make sure after I've consumed 50% of my budget and my schedule that I have the highest value half of my backlog and there aren't higher value things remaining unfinished in the backlog. But the other thing we need to be able to do is chunk our problem space, our thing, our product into these small pieces so we can build them a little at a time. And that's where the true opportunity is. So 50% means 50%. And you may have heard the term minimal viable product or MVP. This is circling a subset of your product backlog and saying, this is enough of our product to actually deploy and start getting business value. And then at that point, we continue to build on it if we want to, or if it makes sense, or maybe determine it doesn't make sense. I was working with a client a couple years ago where it was about a 6-month effort to build this product. And at the 3-month mark, the product owner came in and she announced she was shutting down the project and declaring success because at the 50% mark, she had half of her product built, product-centric approach, and she had already attained 90% of the ROI or business value that was in her plan. It didn't make sense to her to spend the next 3 months building the other 10% of the business value. So instead, she just accepted that, deployed it, and then repurposed the team to work on this other higher value product that they had in their project portfolio. So creating the product backlog. How do we do this? So I've kind of broken it down into a multi-step process here. It's not this mechanical. I want it to feel more fluid for you, but this helps you from a learning standpoint understand what the component parts of building a backlog are all about. You need to start with the scope, start with a vision. That's definitely job one. Step two, identify who your stakeholders are. Who, in other words, who has an interest in what this product is and what it should contain? Who cares about it? Those become my stakeholders. Some could be financial stakeholders, some could be customer stakeholders, user stakeholders, some could be other business stakeholders. Step three is, once we know who our stakeholders are, let's find out what they want the product to contain. We get their requirements, we elicit them, either directly by talking with them or by proxy, having somebody represent them. I'm going to describe each of these steps with examples. Then once we have the stakeholder requirements, then we can chunk them or make them smaller so that they align with the time boxing in Sprint, in Scrum. So if something's bigger than a sprint time box, then it's too big to fit our sprint backlog, so we need to fix it or make it smaller. And that's predominantly time boxing is a component of Scrum, not Kanban, so it's more applicable in the Scrum world. Step five is order the backlog by business priority, by value, and by other factors. And if we want to measure and do some forecasting of when we're going to be done and how much this thing's going to cost, we can also use some metrics, sizing and weighting. So looking through those steps, take you back to the planning onion and thinking of the abstract planning down to the very granular planning. We start with a vision, and then within our vision for our product, we develop a product roadmap. And then from that product roadmap, we could break it into multiple releases. And then each release within the roadmap is what we need a product backlog for. So a product backlog could support a single release within the product roadmap, or it could support multiple consecutive releases because of the very fluid process. And I just draw a line in the product backlog to say, once I've reached this point, that's release one. Sometimes we can anticipate those and plan those ahead. Sometimes we decide them empirically while we're in the midst of the project based on seeing the actual results that have been produced and the value potential that we have out of it. Then within the release, we break our release up into multiple time boxes in the Scrum framework, and we call these sprints. Some refer to them as iterations outside the Scrum world. This is where our sprint backlog comes in. And even within the sprint backlog, every single day, the team gets together to develop a plan every single day for that day's work to make sure that they're going to accomplish the goal that they set out for that sprint. So you'll see where this alignment is. Whether or not you use the planning onion in your work, you'll find that understanding these varying levels of abstraction and planning is helpful to understand. So a plan is not equivalent to another plan. Some are more granular, some are more abstract that help establish our goal and our target for where we're going. So when we talk about step one, which is describing the vision or the scope of the product, what we're really talking about here is we need somebody fairly high up in the product organization or in the business itself to determine where are we going with this thing? What do we have in mind for this? Might be a very rough sketch, but we want to have some idea about what's our value proposition, how do I describe this thing at a fairly abstract level, and what's the approximate time frame? Now, this scares people because they start thinking, wait a minute, time frame, is this a commitment? Is this an estimate that I'm going to be stuck with, that this has to be done in 6 months? Well, the key is we want to have some idea. If we find that this product is going to take months or years to build, it may no longer align with the vision or the needs of the business. So it's important that the vision contains some type of a time frame, but the reality is, how do we actually manage what can get done within a period of time? That's where we use the frameworks to help and provide the feedback so we can recalibrate our forecasts of the schedule and budget as needed. So let me use an example. Let's say, and I want to use a non-technical example. So let's say our vision is to build a virtual workplace workshop. Could have used this about 6 months ago, but still relevant today. So our vision is to provide employees with tips and techniques for virtual working with an emphasis on productivity, safety, security, and health. So This is kind of a very abstract description. So how would we take this workshop we're going to develop as our product and break it down to build a backlog and use that backlog? So continuing step one, which is vision and scope, is defining our product roadmap. This is our candidate release plan. This is about how many releases would we anticipate. Again, it's a forecast and some type of a forecast of what our business value is going to be by release as well. So I gave a very abbreviated version of a roadmap here, but let's say we're going to do this in 3 releases. So the first one will have 2 webinars, the second one will have 2 webinars, and the third release will be to turn this into a half-day virtual class. So we can start getting value after release 1, then release 2 more value, and release 3 our ultimate value. So that becomes our release roadmap. And then we get into release planning, so we get more granular for our release. So we determine in release 1 that we're going to build 2 modules, and those modules are going to be online tooltips and virtual meeting best practices, as an example. So this helps define the scope. It's not our backlog, but it becomes the starting point for our backlog. So this whole approach I'm describing here is called top-down. And I've been in software development for over 35 years, and I will tell you from the very beginning, even on old waterfall techniques, top-down is always the preferred approach for managing requirements in any context. And we get the additional value when we're using an iterative approach of taking top-down and being able to chunk it into completed chunks of work. So step 2 is once we have our vision, once we have a clear picture about our product roadmap and a rough sketch of the releases, then for the release that we're working on, determine who are the stakeholders. In other words, who cares about this thing that we're building? So some are going to have a direct interest in what the product contains because they're going to be using. For in this example here, maybe a student, maybe a curriculum designer because they have to build the course, maybe a course instructor because they have to teach the course. But there's also non-user stakeholders. These are people who care about what the product contains, but they're not actually going to be consuming it in this role. For example, my online tool experts, maybe my Azure DevOps experts, maybe the learning management organization, but there's also potentially external stakeholders. And external stakeholders might not even necessarily be actual people that I can talk to. Maybe it's government regulations. Maybe it's local regulations regarding COVID-19. Maybe if I was building a retail system, it's sales tax tables and laws and regulations. So somehow we need to represent those external entities as external stakeholders through proxies inside our team or inside our organization, so they can represent those needs onto our product backlog as well. Once we know who all these stakeholders are, then we can identify what are each of their specific requirements. So I just depicted this abstractly here, but the student says, I want remote tooltips, meeting best practices, time management as an example. Maybe we do a focus group and elicit some of those ideas or requirements, maybe some experimentation. But also I pull in PBIs from these other stakeholders as well to make sure that I've identified all the component parts. And again, when you see PBI here, I want you to think noun. This is just stuff. These aren't tasks. These aren't the tasks of building the workshop. These are just the pieces of the completed workshop that are broken into parts so we can build it a little at a time. All right, so once we assemble all of those backlog items, we can pull them into our product backlog and get it organized. So the next step is, some of them are going to be big, some of them are going to be small. And what does big and what does small really mean? Well, let's pull one out as an example here. Let's say remote tooltips is one of our PBIs that comes on that list for a backlog here. So question I need to ask when I'm doing my planning is, what is it going to take to actually turn that from a yellow sticky into an actual completed module that covers the content of remote tooltips, which is our chunk or increment of our product? So I have a couple questions to ask. One is, what does it take to be able to call this done? There's work that's involved there. That's where the definition of done comes in, which is shown below the sticky there. So this is our checklist of completion criteria for each and every learning module that I built in the context of this organization. But I also have to look at my team working agreement and our established agreement on what our sprint duration is going to be. If our duration is 2 weeks and I have to satisfy all of these tasks in the definition of done, can I do that? Can I accomplish all of this within a 2-week time frame? If the answer is yes, then leave it in the backlog and leave it alone. It's good enough. If it's no, if it's going to take longer than the 2-week time box commitment, then I need to chunk it, meaning break it up into smaller pieces. So as an example, I might take it, let's say it is bigger than a 2-week time commitment. So I break it maybe into Microsoft Teams tips and Azure DevOps tips. And then I find Teams, as ADO can be built in 2 weeks, but the Teams tips can't be built within our 2-week time box. So we break that into virtual meeting tools versus content management, et cetera, et cetera. These are just examples, but this is the process. So in other words, chunk it into a smaller backlog item. If it doesn't fit the time box, establishing working agreement of a sprint, in satisfaction of all the items in our definition of done for each of the component parts of our backlog. If it fits in the time box, leave it alone. Don't spend any more effort on trying to break it up. Step 5, order the backlog. So I can only build one or a few things at a time within my time frame. So let's make sure I build them in the right order. So when I reach that 50% mark, like in the story I told you about earlier, I've already built the highest value stuff. I don't have any leftover high value things below it on the list. Now, there's a number of ways to prioritize or order the backlog. Now, by the way, they used to call it prioritizing the backlog, but that seems to imply that it's solely based on business priority, and understand that there's other criteria at play, like there could be dependencies that are other necessities where something that's lower business value becomes a predecessor to something else in the backlog. So that's why the Scrum Guide now calls it ordering the backlog. This approach you've seen on the right here was actually facilitating a portfolio planning meeting with one of my clients this morning, and we actually use a matrix like this. If you have any experience with project portfolio management, you've probably used this matrix or something like it. So you take all of your, we use that in portfolio management, where each of these individual parts here is a complete project. Here we take the same approach and apply it to our backlog. So some provide higher business value, some provide lower business value. Some are harder to build, some are easier to build. So if you kind of plot them in here and you distribute them evenly across the 9 cells, then this helps you in ordering the backlog items without getting to the granularity of having to do a thorough mathematical analysis of each and every PBI, because you're not going to get a whole lot of additional value out of a more granular analysis of the ordering. So we just want to kind of a gut feel here. So we'll put all the things in box 1 near the top of the backlog, all the things in box 9 down here near the bottom of our backlog, and distribute the other things in accordance with their business value against complexity. Now you could use Moscow, must, could, should, won't, or some other ordering technique as well, but I wanted to suggest this one. Step 6, relative weighting or sizing helps with forecasting. In all the time I spent with all the coaching and training I've done with Agile teams at various companies, metrics seem to cause the most confusion. So let me kind of break it down here. I'm not going to talk about burn down in this presentation, because that's a measurement tool that's used in measuring remaining effort within the 2-week time box of a sprint. I'm going to talk about burn up and velocity, which are the metrics used across the release. This is where relative sizing fits in. So relative weighting helps us find a way to measure up all the PBIs relative to each other. And this is a whole topic by itself. We could spend a whole hour on techniques and best practices for sizing a backlog. But in a nutshell, and I'll use Planning Poker as an example, that one's been around since extreme programming in the 90s. It's a long-standing one. T-shirt sizing's become increasingly popular. White elephant sizing is more nuanced, but it's a really quick way to size a big backlog. If you want to learn about white elephant sizing and you haven't used it before, go to tastycupcakes.org, which has instructions on how to do that. But the backlog sizing, essentially we take the smallest item in the backlog once we have our initial backlog, give it a size of 1, and then we weight. Think of it more as weighting than sizing. We weight all the others relative to that using some predetermined schema. And the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, 100 seems to be the predominant one, but it's not that precise. It doesn't have to be those specific numbers. So then we have this weighted scale sizing of all the items in our backlog. We have no idea what that equates to in terms of budget and schedule until we actually determine how much backlog can we build within a time box. Once you've sized your backlog using relative sizing, and again, this should not be a huge effort. Planning poker can take a little bit longer. If you just want to get it sized and you're not too worried about precision, I'd suggest going for t-shirt or white elephant sizing. They're much, much faster. But once we have the metrics in there, then we can determine the total size of our backlog against how much of it we've actually built. And the math becomes very helpful there. So this is where the terms burn up and velocity come into play. And if I have a variance between my velocity and my ideal target velocity, then I'll see that either I'm not going to build everything, or we're going to be behind schedule, and then I can make accommodations and adjustments as I need to refactor my plan. Also, the team. So that helps from a product management standpoint in planning ahead and budget and schedule, but it also helps the team when I measure size in planning my next sprint. As if it's not that I can finish 3 PBIs or product backlog items per sprint. It's I can finish about 20 points worth of items per sprint, which might be 1 PBI in the next sprint, or it might be several PBIs. So it helps the team and it helps the release management as well. A little bit further on the math without going overboard here. So if I have relative sizes on my product backlogs, these are all just weights, and I sum them all up, then I can use it to forecast the schedule as I described, recalibrate my forecast when the velocity changes, meaning how much product is built per sprint, recalibrate when the backlog changes, because if I add items to the backlog, that's going to cause the schedule to go longer as well if I don't pull something equally sized off the backlog. And it also helps me chunk any product backlog items that are bigger than my expected velocity. So in this example here, let's say my backlog is comprised of 306 points, and then in my most recent sprint, I finished an 8 and a 5 and a 3, which gives me a total of 16 points. So doing the math here, if I divide 306 by 16, this gives me a forecast of 19 total sprints, or if it's a 2-week sprint, a total of 38 weeks to finish this entire product backlog. Now, if in the next sprint or the sprint after that, I add a bunch of new things to the backlog, because the question was asked earlier, yes, we're going to discover places where we're missing things in our backlog, then we need to size those as well. And that's going to change the value of the numerator in this equation, which is going to extend our timeline unless we do some subtraction and move things off. So the math is much, much easier than the approach that the PMI teaches with earned value and schedule variance and budget variance, because those are based on tasks versus actual completed product. So these are real metrics based on completed product, not just the hope that the product gets done when we finish all the tasks. I want to throw this in here because this causes a lot of confusion as well. And if you call everything a user story, that's okay. I have a lot of people do that. But I do want to delineate what the original intent of the user story language was. You won't see user story in the Scrum Guide, by the way. The Scrum Guide refers to the product backlog containing PBIs or product backlog items that can be used for anything. The user story format was, it was first explained in Extreme Programming, Kent Beck's book, back in the 90s, but Alistair Coburn actually coined the term in 1998, user story, but the intent was it's a helpful format for describing functional requirements, meaning the functions that software or a machine can accomplish. So here's an example of the Connextra format, which was developed at Connextra Corporation about a year after the concept was initialized. As some role, I want to do this function so that I can accomplish some goal. So you can see this can definitely conform to a functional requirement. But if you're working on business problems or business solutions, or you're using Scrum to write a book or build a PowerPoint presentation or to build a new marketing program, the user story format doesn't fit it very well, and it actually looks kind of weird if you try to fit it in there. So again, the whole idea is the product backlog contains product backlog items. And some of them, if not most of them, depending on what you're building, may also benefit from following the user story format. But don't force the user story format where it's not helpful or applicable. These slides, this presentation, by the way, and I'll mention again at the end, is going to be available on the Improving YouTube channel, so so that you can watch it again and have access to this. Also, from the original days of user stories came out the concept of the 3 C's, which gets to some of the best practices here, which is a quality product backlog item should be short enough to fit in large print, written with a Sharpie on the front of an index card. Then the conversation part of the 3 C's says, I'll elaborate on the details just in time, meaning when I pull it forward and pull it into a sprint, because I don't want to spend too much time elaborating on details on things that may never move up into a sprint backlog because they're further down the backlog. And additionally, I can elaborate on details that won't fit on the front of the index card through acceptance criteria. Confirm that, accept that, test that, those types of items. They can actually help draw out not only details of this backlog item, but it helps you, as you understand it, to determine, you know what, this actually, when I start writing the acceptance criteria, to determine this is too big to get done in the sprint. And that's when you break it out or chunk it into smaller pieces. Also, the term epic. Epic was born out of the user story vocabulary as well. And all epic means, just keeping it simple here, is it's too big to finish in a sprint. If this PBI is size 20 and my team velocity, meaning the number of relative points we typically finish in a sprint, is something less than 20, then that tells me it's infeasible to plan on finishing this PBI within a sprint. So we break it up. And that one PBI of size 20 may break up into 3 PBIs. They don't have to add up to 20. We just have to make sure we remove the sizing of the epic and we carry forward the sizing of the 3 component parts that it pulled together here. Now that could go on and on and on, where maybe the velocity is 10, this PBI of size 13 might be too big as well and it has to be broken up as well. So that's where you have to kind of keep your eye on your backlog and determine where do I need to chunk things into smaller pieces, or find some way to raise my velocity so that's not a problem for me. Right now, some of the tools, and I won't name any of the tools in specifically, but some of the tools have a limit to how many times you can chunk. So that may require some workarounds. I also want to use this opportunity to point out one of the most confusing elements of these projects, and that's definition of done versus acceptance criteria. So understand, definition of done has to do with the entirety of the product backlog. This is our checklist that comes from the development organization or the business organization in terms of what is our completeness criteria for everything we build. So this is going to contain those checklist items that are applicable across the board to all PBIs. And according to the Scrum Guide, it's owned by the development organization, and it's incorporated into the development team, and then they could take that and add to it, but make sure you use the development criteria for success. And if we're building software, this could be compliance things, it could be security things, it could be user UX standards and guidelines, things like that. Acceptance criteria are specific checklist items for a specific PBI. Excuse me while I get water. So those are unique for every one. And then I carry forward the definition on the other. So I don't know, for some reason, this is a big confusion point, and I wanted to make sure I included it here. So let me tie all this together in a kind of a timeline to see what happens when. So a little bit of repetition here, but it'll kind of tie the pieces together. So the whole thing starts with our value proposition, our product vision, a rough idea about how much we're willing to invest in this thing and about when we would expect or want to get it, and identify an owner for the product backlog, the product owner. And then the Scrum team is formed. Stakeholders, high-level requirements are listed at this point. The team launches with working agreements, definition of done, target description of their minimal viable product, and they get started building their initial product backlog. And again, as I mentioned, this process of building the initial product backlog that is our starting point should never take longer than a day. When I say a day, if you're captive with the entire group, with all the stakeholder, either directly or by proxy in the room, you ought to be able to get it done in less than a day. Sometimes because of scheduling and other logistics, a day might equal like 2 hours a day over a multi-day period. But don't go on and on more than 8 hours building your initial product backlog. Get started on building the product and make time to refine it after the case. So back to a pointed answer to the question that was asked earlier, the product backlog will not be complete at this point. Plan to inspect and adapt the backlog throughout the project. And a few tips for you from a remote team launch standpoint, if you're working with a new team or working on its new team, building a new product, try to introduce as much structure as you can into the backlog development day. Even create a launch deck so that you have a consistent process to make sure we don't forget or include definition of done, working agreements, understanding of vision and scope, and the stakeholder requirements that are brought into the meeting, and also gain confidence with the tools before the meeting so you're not learning the tool on the fly. I can't tell you how many virtual meetings I've been on where we throw up Microsoft Whiteboard and we spend half the meeting teaching people how to use the tool. So try to get all the learning out of the way beforehand. And don't let data capture slow you down. So I've been working with a client that uses ADO, Azure DevOps, which is one of multiple great tools out there. Entering the data in the web interface of Azure DevOps can really slow you down. And if you're trying to capture it in the tool during this time where you have everybody together working in the backlog, it could really slow you down. So what I would suggest as an alternative is capture the data in a Word document or a spreadsheet, and then you can import it into the tool later after the meeting. So that way we're maximized. It's much easier to move things around and sort them in a spreadsheet or a Word document than the mechanics of filling out the forms in the ADO tool. So again, ADO is a great tool, but don't let it slow you down in these meetings. Try a faster approach and do the import later. All right, after we have our initial backlog and we get started, then the team does sprint planning. So this is where they build their to-do, doing, done board, their Scrum board, which is a borrowed practice from Kanban, for example, as an example. PBIs are selected and brought into the sprint, and those little blue tasks there represent the items, represent the tasks in the to-do column. Another optional metric here is you can weight your tasks as well. Most teams use hours because it's the easiest way to weight tasks. That way the team has the opportunity to measure their progress toward their sprint goal based on tasks in the to-do, doing, done columns and their relative size as well. So the team can recalibrate as needed. But that's not really the scope of this presentation. I was focused more on the product backlog, but that's where that metric fits in. And then budget time for backlog refinement. If we start without a complete product backlog, we need to make time in subsequent sprints to refine it, add things to it, chunk them into smaller pieces, resize things as needed, maybe elaborate with acceptance criteria on things near the top of the backlog. This is an important ongoing activity. The product owner should take primary responsibility for it, but the Scrum team ought to kick in with that as well and support that, and sometimes lead that as well to make sure the backlog's effective. Remember, the product owner is predominantly responsible for making sure we build the right thing. That doesn't mean that they are available or can do all the work involved in refining that backlog. And backlog refinement is not one of the required Scrum events, only because it may not be needed in every sprint. As you're reaching the halfway point in your project, you must find that your backlog's fairly stable, and I don't want to have a fixed required event when it's not needed. So that's why it's in there, it's discussed, it's just not described as a required event. At the end of the sprint, we do our sprint review. We bring in the stakeholders or representatives of the stakeholders, see what we've built so far, show them the increment, and describe what's coming up. And optionally, we can use those metrics here as well. I like to lead with showing the burn-up chart so that the stakeholders can see where we are. Do we have a variance below or above the ideal line on our burn-up chart? And what is our forecast of the budget and schedule? You ought to be able to easily calculate that at the end of every sprint. A lot of people are afraid to share that, but the reality is if you don't share it and you're not transparent with leadership about it, they don't have data they can work with. And if it sounds like a commitment, I'm committing to finish this thing in 10 sprints, well, then that's not realistic, and that becomes a cultural thing. But that, again, could be a whole other hour-long presentation. I'm just talking about the mechanics of managing the backlog. A couple anti-patterns to be aware of. If the product owner is solely responsible for the backlog contents, we're laying a lot of risk that one individual is solely responsible for everything. They need to be proxy representative of all the external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, user stakeholders, but they also need to engage the team as well and leverage their expertise as well in terms of what makes sense and what can be built and when. Make sure you're not just building for the past, but you're building for what the future state. If you look at the top 10 companies in the world today from a market cap standpoint versus 10 years ago, the list has done a complete refresh. So companies that aren't reinventing themselves and becoming agile organizations will continue to stay stuck in their previous successes. So you want to make sure you have a forward-looking view on product ownership and product strategy. And another one is your backlog creation meeting, that one meeting that happens before you start the first sprint. If it's unstructured and we're just going to sit around the table and stick a bunch of virtual stickies on the virtual whiteboard and then figure out how to organize them all, then you're going to end up with a mess that's going to take a long time to clean up. You're also going to end up with a lot of gaps and certainly overlaps. If you take the stakeholder-driven top-down approach that I described earlier, that will help you make sure we cover all our bases, we don't have gaps, and we can avoid overlaps as well. When it comes to the portfolio level, and that's where we're managing the work in our portfolio. I want to use this as an example. I mentioned Moscow earlier, must, should, could, won't. So when it comes to managing which project should I do and in what order should I do them, project A, B, C, D, E, F, I only have enough budget to do 3 of them. That can be limiting in some ways, particularly if everything is labeled as a must-have. So tying in that matrix I showed you earlier and raising it up above the project level to the portfolio level, now I can chunk in each of these 6 projects and I can determine, yes, project C is going to get done first, and project F, unfortunately, high complexity, low business value, probably will never get built if I don't have enough budget. But take it another step further from there. Break your product backlog, and this is the reason I'm describing this in this talk. If you can break your product backlog into component parts, increment 1, increment 2, product B has 3 increments, then it's possible that product A1 is high priority, product B1 is high priority, but product F1 is also higher priority than A2 is. Then you can move these moving pieces around. Now, this can be disruptive to an organization because you put a captive team together to work on product A, and if we're going to take that budget from product A and move it to the F team, then what do we do with those A people? So this is where portfolio management and managing budgets and resources can be complicated. And again, portfolio management could be a whole other hour talk as well, but I just wanted to kind of tease you with that and give you a little peek into how that is done. So we're nearing the end here, and I want to leave time if there were any questions, if you could type them into the chat now, or if we have any that we haven't covered yet.
Yeah, we have a few questions.
Sure.
All right. So first one says, while working on the MVP, you have not released a product. How do you get feedback from stakeholders? It's a little risky to let them access an incomplete project.
Yeah, so when we talk about an MVP, we're truly talking about something that's potentially deployable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we deployed it. So we'll never truly know what the business value is until it's out in progress. So it becomes a leading indicator from a metric standpoint until the point that we actually start realizing revenue contribution, cost savings, or other business necessities like compliance and safety and health and things like that. So it's still a projection, but it becomes a more informed projection or forecast based on actually having a tangible product that I can look at.
All right. And then another question says, how can a PO balance out between operations activities, for instance, bugs, and introducing new features? In some projects, every bug seems to be like a high priority fire to extinguish.
Yeah, in some organizations, they have a separate maintenance organization for a product that's already been released, but then you lose the benefit of the focus team that has the best knowledge of the product itself. So after you deploy something, you have to anticipate having to budget time for ongoing maintenance and bug fix, but you have to also determine as you triage those adjustments, which are high priority and which are things that people can live with, because the more time I spend on maintenance, the less capacity I have to work on ongoing development. But if there's high business value that's sitting on the table undeveloped because I'm so busy maintaining the deployed application, then the business might look at investing more in this particular team so I can get more investment in there so I can get more product out. But I also want to suggest as well, if you're having a lot of quality issues when you're delivering, you might look at some tooling, and particularly if you're building software for automated regression testing, so that we can anticipate and catch quality problems before they go out the door. And that's one of the technical and business benefits we get from using an empirical approach to development, is doing that early testing and drawing all those mistakes out early on. Other questions?
I've got one more. Says, you mentioned PBI resizing should happen on the fly. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like?
The plan should always reflect reality. The plan should always reflect reality. The product backlog should reflect the things that are actually going to be in the product. The sizing, the relative sizing, ought to reflect our current knowledge about the size of something. If I put something up on the backlog and I gave it a 5, and then after I work on these other items, I determine, whoa, that was bigger than a 5. It should have been a 20. Change it from a 5 to a 20 so that your forecasts can be an accurate reflection of the current state of the backlog. Now, that may cause an impact to your schedule or your budget, but you want to know that early on so you can make business decisions on what do we do about that. Do we pull something out of the scope? Do we extend the schedule, extend the budget, try to increase our velocity in some ways? So at least the options are available to us if they do reflect reality on the backlog. Was that the last question?
Yep, that's all the questions we have.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with me today, and hopefully you enjoyed your lunch. Those who are in my time zone, here's my contact information, ken.howardimproving.com. Please reach out to us. Thank you for being a part of our community, and do look for the Improving YouTube channel where this and the other previous webinars are posted for your viewing, and look forward to getting your feedback. And at that, we'll close this out. Thank you very much.